see if this works. I can't go too far though, so. I don't have a stand, so I can't use my hands this morning. We'll use the piano. Ah, there we go. Thanks. Greg's there whenever you need him, isn't he? What you'll find in a church like River City is that at any given time there are certain families that are going through high times, like when they just welcome a newborn child. And what the writer is saying here is that when someone in your church family experiences a high time like that, you need to be celebrating with them as though that child were your own niece or nephew. All right? Love each other. The actual translation is with brotherly love. With brotherly love. And it also means that at the same time, in a church this size, there are people that are experiencing incredible hardship, trials, and difficulties. And it's saying that when you know somebody in your church family who's going through one of these difficult times, then you need to empathize with them and encourage them as though they were your actual brother or sister. So the first word is a word for people in the church, and it's expressed in the way that we treat each other. But the author doesn't end there, because in verse 2, he expands it to those outside the church. I'm going to quote it. Verse 2 says, "Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it." So now we're back to the topic of angels again. The series is called Angels, Demons, and Jesus. Think of how cool it would be if you purchased a Tim Hortons gift card and you gave it to somebody who was homeless, somebody on the street, and later discovered that that person was actually an angel. Or a different scenario. Imagine that you are a regular River City attender and you notice somebody here on a Sunday morning who is obviously here for their very first time, and you get the courage up to actually invite that person to your house or out for lunch the next Sunday. And then you later discover, after entertaining them and hosting them at your home, that that person or that family were actually angels. And you say, well, that sounds ridiculous. But the fact is, the Bible mentions, just in the first few books, at least 3 instances where people who loved God entertained angels without realizing it at the time. One was Abraham, another one was Gideon, and the third was Manoah. And these people entertained and hosted people who were strangers, but who ended up being angels. And so that's our incentive as God's people today, to show hospitality and to love people outside the church community as well. We need to make room in our little worlds for newcomers. And that begs the question that each of us should be asking is do I have room in my world, right? Like Melissa said at the time of the offering, do I have the blinders on? Is my whole reason for being about me and my family? Or do I have room in my world for people who are further away, people who are strangers? Next verse. We've talked about love within the church in one verse. Second verse is love to people outside the church. Third verse, don't forget about those in prison. Suffer with them as though you were there yourself. Share the sorrow of those being mistreated as though you feel their pain in your own bodies. Now, if you've been coming to this series, you know that this letter, Hebrews, was written to a congregation of believers who are being persecuted. They're in a context where they're being persecuted for their Christian faith. And so it's very, very likely that as the writer is encouraging them to be empathetic toward people in prison, that names and faces are coming to mind. People who actually were members of that church were very likely being mistreated, and some of them were likely in prison as well. So remember people in your congregation who can't be there because they're being mistreated. And then verse 4, completely different topic. Give honor to marriage, and remain faithful to one another in marriage. God will surely judge people who are immoral and those who commit adultery. Up until now, it's been relatively light, right? Love each other, love outsiders. Remember people who are in prison. And all of a sudden there's this real heavy, almost 10 Commandments kind of feel to Hebrews chapter 13, where we're told to honor marriage. And I think that if I were a single person and I would read this, I would kind of go on to the next verse. I would think, well, that's for married people, and I'm not married, so I'm off the hook. And the answer is wrong. Hebrews 13 wasn't written for a marriage class in a church somewhere. It was written for a congregation that almost inevitably included married people, but also single people. So when we're told to honor marriage, that means everybody. And I think that if you're single, it means that your interactions with married people demonstrate your respect for the relationship that that person has with his or her spouse. It means that if you're single, you treat married people differently than you treat other adults who are unmarried. And then if you're like me, if you're married, it's like, whoa. I mean, there's an important message here. We live in a culture where casual sex is glamorized and often trivialized, even extramarital affairs. But you need to know, I think the writer of Hebrews is saying, that there is nothing glamorous about a husband or a wife who has a sexual relation outside of their marriage. There's nothing glamorous about a husband or a wife who violates their marriage vow by being excessively flirtatious with someone other than their spouse. I'll tell you what is attractive, and you guys will agree, I'm sure. If you've ever been to somebody's like 40th or 50th wedding anniversary, and you see this couple that are obviously still in love, and you know that they've been through better or for worse, through sickness or through health, and yet they still have a respect and a love for one another. That is attractive and beautiful, but it doesn't sell tabloids. Husbands and wives, the whole faithfulness to marriage vows is a test that heaven takes far more seriously than we do. According to Malachi chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. Married people who fail to guard their marriage vows will miss out on God's blessings in this life. God will withhold His blessing. Think of a farmer, and you've planted your crops, and you're looking forward to the fall harvest, and all you're doing is you're just waiting for the rain. Everything else has been done. Fertilizing, plowing, tilling. I don't know if I got the right order, but everything is ready. The stuff is in the ground. You've done all you can do, and now you're waiting for that rain. Malachi 2 says that if us married people violate our marriage vows, God will withhold that rain of blessing from our lives. Serious. And then Revelation 22, the last chapter of the last book of the New Testament, says that married people who fail to guard their marriage vows will miss out on eternity with God. They'll miss out on heaven. And suddenly it's very quiet in here. Now this doesn't mean that if you're married and you violated your marriage vow that you're as good as gone, that there's no hope for you. It does mean that if this is your scenario, you need to repent to God and to your spouse and to anybody else that you may have hurt. You got to come clean and ask for forgiveness, and then you need to commit to maintaining sexual morality from this point forward. And that is the path to marriage blessing. So we've hit a number of topics in just 4 verses, and then in verse 5, the author switches again to another topic, the topic of trust, and especially as trust relates to our money. I want to read verses 5 and 6. Stay away from the love of money. Be satisfied with what you have. For God has said, I will never fail you. I will never forsake you. Which is why we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. So I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? The truth is that you and I will either put our absolute primary trust in God or in something else. And generally that something else is our money. Now I'd expect, as I'm sure you would expect, that if a person is not a Christian, if they're not a follower, if they don't recognize themselves or identify themselves as a follower of Jesus, that they would naturally put their trust in money. That they would make sure that they have enough money to meet the needs for today, that they would store some money for the needs of tomorrow. I mean, that makes sense.